Hello? 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 Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you for joining us on this Saturday evening. Sorry. But yeah, we appreciate you coming out. And so this roundtable is called The Concept of Mother Tongue Across Asian Contexts. So this is part of our GIAN course, which is imagining mother tongue in South Asia. It's been going on for 4 or 5 days now with Professor Chase Laduza, who some of you have know, and Professor Christina Davis. We have a guest with us tonight, Professor Karim Friedman. So I'll just introduce them, and then we'll be very brief about the roundtable. Professor okay, anyway, just read from here. So Professor Christina Davis is she says associate, but now she's professor of anthropology at Western Illinois University. And her research is mostly about language, digital media practices, multilingual education, and ethnic conflict. Her primary fieldwork was in Sri Lanka, although she's also done fieldwork in India. And her book is called The Struggle for a Multilingual Future, Youth and Education in Sri Lanka, which was published in 2020. And she's a co-editor of the journal she's a co-editor of the book, the volume, which was published from Routledge, Language, Education, and Identity, Medium in South Asia. With her is Professor Chase Laduza, who is the Christian A. Johnson Excellence in Teaching Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at Hamilton College, USA. And his interests include language and culture, political economy, and education. And he's written 2 books. One is Hindi is Our Ground, Hindi is Our Ground, English is Our Sky, Education, Language, and Social Class in Contemporary India. And the other one is called House, Signs, and College Fun, right? Which is about the higher education in the United States, looking at the languages of hostels, hostel signboards. So these are his. One is in India, in schools in Varanasi, and one is in the United States. So he's done both. He's done fieldwork in both regions. And he's also, along with Professor Davis, a co-editor of Language, Education, and Identity Medium in South Asia. And with us also is Professor P. Karim Friedman, who is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Relations and Cultures at National Donghua University in Taiwan. So his research has mainly explored the language revitalization efforts among indigenous Taiwanese, looking at the relationship between language ideology, indigeneity, and political economy. So his one interest is in linguistic anthropology, and another interest is in ethnographic filmmaking. He is an ethnographic filmmaker, and he's worked on various ethnographic films. He also was the chair of the Ethnographic Film Festival in Taiwan, and he co-produced the documentary, award-winning documentary called Please Don't Beat Me, Sir, about the street theater group Budhan Theater, which is located in Ahmedabad in Charanagar. So he spent a good bit of time in our area as well. So it's very nice to welcome him back to Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar. So we have just a little gift for them. So maybe Haifa or FTA can give you the mementos for them coming. So it's just some. Yeah. So let's just give them one applause.
don't need to photograph it like in Taiwan.
Yeah, we usually do.
In Taiwan, we always do like.
Yeah. We do that here too. We'll do that. We'll do that at the end. We'll get a photograph of all of us. We have to get some proof for social media. So, okay, so just to introduce, we've been talking, some of you who are in the course, we've been talking about mother tongue in South Asia, how it's developed, different ideas along with linguistic anthropology. But now we're going to try to widen the scope by including other Asian contexts and just have a conversation about this idea of mother tongue, ethnic identity, language in relation to both shared and diverging experiences of colonization, right? Taiwan has a very different history of colonization. It's been colonized by the Japanese, by the Chinese, so not by the British like India and Sri Lanka. Then the post-colonial histories also have been different as well. And Sri Lanka's post-colonial history has been different than India's also, not to mention Taiwan's. But there are similarities in both are very multilingual areas. Both are trying to manage this idea of official languages, non-official languages, and how to educate the people, and ethnic assertion. So these are all there. So I think we're going to start the conversation. So what we're going to do is each panelist will have around 10 minutes just to, have some opening remarks. And then I have just a few questions that they can respond to, and then you all, the rest of it is up to you. So you please interact. So we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. It's not a formal talk or lecture. So yeah. So we'll start with Professor Friedman. So Karim, would you wanna?
Before I start, I want to ask a question. I want everybody to be honest. If I were to give you a blank map, it didn't have the countries written on it, right? It doesn't say India, it just shows the thing. How many of you are confident you could point to Taiwan? 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Okay, that's not very good. So I mean, it's not surprising, but I just wanted to kind of start a little bit giving. I don't have a map or visuals, but if you think about Taiwan, it's a little bit like China's Sri Lanka. Okay, so just off the coast of China, almost close enough that you can see across the water, is the landmass is maybe about 80% of the size of Sri Lanka. The population is about the same as Sri Lanka, so it's a pretty good comparison. But one thing that a lot of people here get confused about, because a lot of people, when I've spoken to them over the past few weeks about Taiwan, they seem to think that it's very similar to Hong Kong. It's not. Hong Kong was seized by the British during the Opium War, and they made an agreement with China that they would return it after 100 years. Taiwan was never really part of China. It was during the Qing dynasty, they ruled part of Taiwan. They had some outposts, but they didn't even then, they didn't control most of Taiwan. Taiwan is mostly mountains, and they had a red line marking off the mountains. And so in the 19th century, Japanese fishing boat crashed on the east coast of Taiwan. The west coast is what faces China. On the east coast of Taiwan, there was a boat crash, and a bunch of sailors came ashore, and they were all killed by what you would call tribal population, Adivasi population. We call them indigenous, but they were killed by the tribal population, and the Japanese sued the Chinese government. They went to the government and said, give us compensation for our sailors who were killed in Taiwan. And the Chinese government said, we anything over this red line, which is just sort of the western part of the island, that's tribal area. We don't control that. So Taiwan only really became part of China when, after World War II, it had been a Japanese colony for 50 years, 1895 to the end of World War II. At that time, the Japanese surrendered to America. They actually surrendered Taiwan to America. So some people argue that Taiwan actually is officially should be a state of America. That's pushing it a bit. But what America did was they gave it to, at that time there was a civil war in China, the communists versus the nationalists. And Taiwan was given to the nationalists. Except as you probably know, the nationalists lost the war. So when they lost the civil war, they said, well, that looks like a good place to retreat to. So they retreated to Taiwan, but they were basically an invading force in Taiwan. They were not the local. There had been ethnically Chinese people in Taiwan for 400 years, but about 1 million soldiers came in 1945, 1947, and there was a major uprising of the Taiwanese against these soldiers who came over and took over the island by force. And then for the next 40 years, Taiwan was under martial law. It was not a democracy. And during that time, they imposed Mandarin Chinese as the national language of Taiwan. That language had never been spoken by anybody in Taiwan before. So I'm actually studying Hindi now, and I'm actually finding it very frustrating because in Taiwan, because Mandarin Chinese was never anybody's official language, all the TV shows that are in Mandarin all have subtitles. So when you're studying Mandarin, you can read the subtitles. But in India, nothing in Hindi has Hindi subtitles. It has English subtitles or other languages, but you don't have Hindi with Hindi subtitles here because Hindi was never sort of imposed from outside in that way. So that's a very different situation there in Taiwan. And then the indigenous population that I work with, they're still there, the Adivasi. I teach at basically what you would call a tribal academy. It's part of a national university, but it's a tribal academy. In Taiwan, half of our students are indigenous, but for Taiwan, they're only 2% of the population. And right now, 16 indigenous languages are recognized as official languages in Taiwan, with 42 varieties of those languages. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. There are some other groups that want to get recognition, but I just wanted to make sure, because I know people here don't have that background. So I wanted to give you a little background before I start. But let me put on my glasses now and read. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about mother tongue in Taiwan, it is in opposition to this concept of national language. In Taiwan, national language there's a Chinese term for it, which is guoyu. That means the national language, literally. But the thing is I don't know if you know, but like a lot of Chinese characters can also be written, they can also be Japanese. You could write the same characters and pronounce them as Japanese. And so the Japanese use those same two characters for guoyu or national language, but they pronounced it gunigo. So gunigo or guoyu actually means the same thing. And so the Japanese so Taiwan has had two official national languages, and they were both called guoyu, those characters, but initially for 50 years it was Japanese, and then for 50 years it was Mandarin, right? So that's important to understand. Then, like I said, in the 1947, after they suppressed the rebellion, what's called the 228 rebellion in Taiwan, and imposed martial law, they then had, because they felt that the lack of a national language was one of the things limiting communication between the million soldiers who came over and the people they're trying to rule. So they imposed Mandarin as the official language, and they had a Speak Mandarin campaign. Now, another country that had a Speak Mandarin campaign was Singapore, but the history of Speak Mandarin campaign in Singapore is very different from in Taiwan. It has a different history, different reasons. I'm not going to go into that. So the Speak Mandarin campaign, during that campaign, the important thing is people were not allowed to speak their own languages, their mother tongues in school. And not just in school, like if you're living in a village and you're speaking your language, whether it's the dominant, so let me give you an overview of the languages in Taiwan. Most people in Taiwan, 75% of the people speak a language that we can just call Taiwanese today, or Taigi. That language, Taiwanese, is a Sinitic language. It's very close to Cantonese, say. So it's a Southern Chinese language, and that's the majority language in Taiwan. There's another language, which is Hakka, which is actually widely spoken in India as well, since a lot of the Chinese who came to India are Hakka. The people who work in the shoe industry and leather industry in India, like in Calcutta, they're mostly Hakka, and they still marry Hakka from Canada and Guangdong, Canton. So Hakka is spoken about 15%, Taiwanese by 75%, and then 2% of Taiwanese speak all these other languages. And then more recently, there are immigrant languages. So Taiwan has negative birth rate. For some reason, Taiwanese women don't want to marry Taiwanese men. They probably don't want to work on a farm or in a shop. They're all very educated. So a lot of Taiwanese men are getting brides from Vietnam and Indonesia. And so all these other languages are coming in now, which they call new Taiwanese languages, and Vietnamese and things like that. So that's the language landscape in Taiwan. Now, so like I said, these two national languages were never the mother tongue. Japanese and then Mandarin were never the mother tongue of any of these people. But they both were very successfully imposed. By the end of the World War II, most educated Taiwanese could speak fluent Japanese, and still Japanese who come to Taiwan speak to older people in Japanese if they, find them. And then Mandarin is now, it's slightly different from the Mandarin spoken in Beijing, but it's mutually intelligible, a little bit like British and American English. Chinese think that Taiwanese Mandarin is cute and feminine. So it's seen as like, whereas Beijing is very masculine and whatever. So there are stereotypes, but so then let's talk about this term mother tongue. It's used in Taiwan, it's used quite widely, but for the groups that I work with, usually the term I will see, even though occasionally you'll see mother tongue referred to, generally it's more likely, there's a lot of overlap, it's more likely to see mother tongue being used to refer to Taiwanese, the majority language, rather than the indigenous, the tribal languages. Those are more likely to be referred to as Zuyu, or ethnic languages. So now all these languages are called Zuyu, they're all called ethnic languages, but there's a bit of a split in what people's actual use. And the third term that's used to refer to these languages is what might be called native or local language, Bantu Yan, which also, again, usually refers to Taiwanese. There was a big literary movement in Taiwan, and it called the Bantu, the native language movement, where they started writing literature and books in Taiwanese. So again, that's mostly referring to the majority population. But see, one of the things I've talked about in my research is that indigenous people, Adivasis in Taiwan, were basically beneficiaries of the majority group claiming their own linguistic rights. Then it had to be given also to the tribals. And so that's how Taiwan became a multicultural country. I actually have a very in-depth political analysis of that process in a paper I wrote in 2018 called The Hegemony of the Local. You can download it from my website. All my papers are on my website. Yeah, so, but then, so when things really changed was, so in Taiwan, in the 1980s, there was a social movement to demand democracy. Why? The main reason was that America had recognized China. Nixon went to China, and Taiwan felt like the whole reason for declaring martial law was that Taiwan was going to someday take back China. And once America recognized China as a country, that myth that Taiwan would somehow invade, and it's a crazy idea, but the idea, they used to train kids in school how to shoot guns, and they really had this idea that we're going to defeat those communist bandits and take over all of China from little Taiwan, which is like smaller than your average city in China. But this idea kind of helped keep the government in power. And once that no longer, in 1973, once Carter signed a treaty with, after Nixon, Carter signed a treaty with China, that excuse kind of fell away, and Taiwan started having a movement to demand democracy. And Taiwan became a democracy. It's now one of the most democratic countries in Asia, if not the most democratic country in Asia. I am now a Taiwanese citizen, and in January, I'll be able to vote for the first time in a Taiwanese presidential election. And it's a completely free and fair and relatively uncorrupt election system where all the votes are counted in public. It's amazing. And Taiwan has had, they finally in 2016 kicked out the Nationalist Party, the KMT, who the US had been propping up until then. They actually finally were kicked out of both president and parliament, and Taiwan's, they're now the outside party, which was unthinkable during the martial law period. And with that has come language reforms. Most importantly, Taiwan passed the National Languages Act of 2019, which was built upon earlier language acts, the Indigenous Language Development Act and the Hakka Basic Act, which had come out a few years before. And what this did is that these laws together, the three of them, established all these indigenous languages as national languages in Taiwan. So now, I mean, practically it doesn't mean a lot, but symbolically, for a country that used to claim to be the true China, to now have indigenous languages, 16 indigenous languages as national languages. And in certain parts of the country now, like even some laws will be translated into those languages, and the script is recognized as national script for people who do work on script. And so, you know, this is a major, major change in how Taiwanese think about this. It hasn't really caught on. A lot of people in Taiwan don't even know that these changes happen, but it's an important thing. So again, I just want to get back. So I was originally talking about this, how in Taiwan, the main term is not mother tongue, but this idea of national languages and then ethnic languages. But now the ethnic languages are also national languages. So that's the main point I wanted to make. How much more time do I have? 4 minutes, okay. So I want to make two, in my last 4 or 5 minutes, I want to make 2 more points. So one of the arguments I make is that even though these have become national languages, they're still marginalized in funny ways. And in my paper that I wrote, the one I just mentioned, I talk about the hegemony of the local and how really these languages are very much seen as being local languages. Even though they now have the official status as national languages, they're really largely seen as just being local. And that's why one of the reasons Taiwan's very unique in terms of preserving local languages, and that all the major dialects are preserved as well. So for instance, of these 16 languages, there are actually 40, you can take, in order, like, let's say you're a tribal and you want to get extra, like they don't have reservations in Taiwan, but you can get a few points added to your national exam score. If you want to get that, you have to prove that you can speak your language. And that exam, the Indigenous Language Proficiency Test, is offered in 42 different language varieties. So these 16 languages, each one has like 4 or 5 different local dialects, each of which is recognized. There are textbooks for it. There are television shows in that language, you know, news broadcasts, radio shows. There are and exams. And then it's even more than that, because each exam is offered at like 6 or 8 different levels of difficulty. So you take whatever, 42 times 8. You can see how it's a huge industry making these exams every year. And so there's a lot of money going into these languages. Are people actually learning them though? That's a question. So that's the last point I want to make. So we're in a situation in Taiwan where the so-called mother tongues have not been spoken by people's mothers for 2 generations, because during the original Speak Mandarin campaign and under the Japanese period, they banned the use of local languages in the village and in the school. If you spoke your language, you used to have to wear a sign saying, I spoke the dialect, and you would be beaten or you would have to pay a fine. And so parents who didn't want their kids to suffer in school started speaking to their kids in Mandarin. And so already back in the 1950s, parents stopped speaking to their kids in their own language. They might speak it to their other parents, or they might use it if they get really upset at their kids and need to curse them out. But otherwise, they would speak to them entirely in Mandarin, and that's happened now for 3 generations. So you have people who are raised by mothers whose mothers and their mothers did not speak these languages at home. It's basically only people over the age of 60 or 70 who still speak these languages. So there's not much time left to really preserve these languages and learn from the native speakers. But I want to talk about one interesting way that they're doing that. My PhD student, Shifula Gao, is a member of the Bangza or Amis ethnic group. And he's one of the leading people advocating for reviving these languages, and not just to take a test, to actually make them a language that people can speak in daily life. And he and his wife, after he visited New Zealand, you know, about 15 years ago, he and his wife decided that their daughters would be raised with the Bangza language as their mother tongue in the home. Now, how do you do that if you yourself don't speak it fluently? There's actually a program for that. There's called the Indigenous Language Nanny Program. So you can hire an older relative and pay them to come and speak to your children in the language. So you bring a 70-year-old woman into the home and her job is to just speak to your children and raise your children, speaking to them entirely in that language at home. And the parents also resolved to never speak to their kids in Mandarin, but they had problems. They talk about how sometimes they needed to talk about finances or school or job things, and they didn't know how to talk about it in their own language. So the couple would go and lock themselves in the bedroom where the daughters couldn't hear and would speak in Mandarin, you know. And sometimes they would get caught by their daughter, and the daughter would say, "We're not supposed to speak, Mandarin in the house," and she would yell at the parents. But here's the thing, that started to change. Why did it change? So this program is great, but it's only great up to a point. What is that point? The kids at some point have to go into the school system, and the schools are still Mandarin taught, especially above. There are some like creches, like language nests, like in New Zealand. But like once you enter primary school, you're in Mandarin. There might be one period a week where you can learn your own language for 40 minutes, and all they do is sing songs because most of the kids in that class don't have the ability to really speak the language. So those classes are very basic. And they're often skipped if there's something else, a math exam or something. So once the kids go into school, everything's in Mandarin. And then so what happens is the daughters then come home and say, like, nobody at school speaks Bangsa. Why should we speak it at home? And so I recently co-wrote a paper with Shiva Logao about how they handled that and how they convinced their daughters to continue to speak in Bangsa. And part of that was that they had a close relationship with the principal of the school. It was a private school run by a Catholic nun, and the nun was a member of the Bangsa ethnic group, and she was sympathetic. So that allowed them to kind of work with the school much closer than most parents can. But this is the kind of situation right now in Taiwan in terms of mother tongue education, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. To be honest, that's my first exposure to the sociolinguistics of Taiwan and its history. So if my comments don't quite hit the mark, please forgive me. My memory is pretty feeble. But all week we've been talking about in the course this idea that mother tongue is this phenomenon, this idea of very widespread salience. In the course, we've been talking about it as a pan-South Asian phenomenon. Karim has informed us that it stretches far beyond those borders, which I had an inkling of, but frankly, the horizon was misty, as it were. I didn't really know just how far. There are, and yet, in the course, we've been talking about the necessity of understanding the interpretive processes by which people actually make sense of entities like mother tongue in their actual lives. So this tacking back and forth of broad context and specific moments works, I think, transnationally, and we can do a little bit of that in this roundtable. One commonality. One obvious commonality of the situation described by Karim and India is the role of colonialism. So you've got a language, English, in India's case, that was there in colonial order, introduced in a colonial order, and introduced for a very specific purpose, and that was to train bureaucrats. And in the Indian case, just like it sounds like in Taiwan, that colonial language has only become more salient in society as we move toward the present. Obviously, in India today, English is not simply a language for training bureaucrats. It has found its way, let's put it that way, into each and every aspect of life in India. Whether you're talking about school, whether you're talking about digital communication, whether you're talking about any sort of media, you'll find, if not the presence of English, the reverberations of the presence of English. And yet, mother tongue seems to be a bit different in its history in India, quite a bit different. One would never, for example, say of India, that mother tongue is never analogous or synonymous, let's say, with some sort of language that has gained some sort of official recognition. We've been talking about in the course that mother tongue is structurally opposed to English and selectively, very selectively, has found its way into associations with all manner of languages that have been inflected by maybe legitimacy on the one hand, ethnic identity on another hand, language activism, if not already achieved. And we've talked about very specific historical mechanisms through which languages actually achieve that recognition, whether it be the Schedule 8 of the Constitution or those languages recognized as official languages by states in India, or early on in the nation's history, the Linguistic Reorganization Act, whereby states started to be created by linguistic divisions. And some of those correspond to mother tongue or people's idea about mother tongue. They don't necessarily, though. And in India, we've been talking about this week about an incredibly complex and shifting terrain. It depends on where you are in India and what the history of that place is, of whether there's a sort of one-to-one correspondence of what standardized language and mother tongue and its differentiation from English, its opposition to English in some cases, it's posed as an opposition, or whether there are many languages by which people can identify themselves as having a mother tongue. I did want to say, in the region where I did my initial dissertation research, there were several languages and people would actually shift. My mother tongue is this, my mother tongue is that, my mother tongue is something that we wouldn't even sort of grant legitimacy to. So my mother tongue is Hindi, my mother tongue is Bhojpuri, my mother tongue is Banarsi Boli, my mother tongue is Pasha, my mother tongue is Holi, my mother tongue is जैसे मैं बोल रहा हूँ. It can be that language which I'm talking right now. Don't you hear it? So lots of different answers, and those actually shift depending on all sorts of things. You know, whether you're answering a questionnaire in school, whether you're talking to someone on the street, whether you get the picture. Also, I would say what's fascinating is that in comparison to Taiwan, it seems that India's desire, let's say, legislative desire to instantiate Indian languages as languages of polities, languages of states, cum regions, seems to have begun a lot earlier, almost immediately, in fact. And in fact, you know, a good historian will tell us, certainly not me, but a good historian will tell us, began before independence, right? In the case of Bengal, for example, in the case of other areas of India, princely states, etc., some areas were consolidated, some areas were divided. And what was imagined as the necessity or the motive for those transitions was often language. And that was happening even prior to independence. But it's certainly the case that a major concern, one might almost say obsession, of writing the Constitution was the disposition of Indian languages as languages of legitimacy, some sort of legitimacy, and the relationship of those to English. I think I'll leave it there. I'll just end with one thing that we've been talking about all week in the course is also the necessity of taking quite seriously how ideas like mother tongue travel, change, transform, and how they emerge in specific moments. And a thing that I've most enjoyed about the course, I have to say, personally, is listening to you all. I know not everyone here is from the course. Listening to you all and listening to the nuance, the elegance, the beauty. I don't know how, what descriptors, but how this idea of mother tongue has captured everyone's imagination in this country. But how all manner of social distinctions, experiences, emotions, understandings of who one is versus other people have emerged very, very specifically, and in fact, in no two cases the same way. Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify. I mean, Taiwan's history is not well known, but I think I just wanted to pick out on something he's about the colonial experience, because very much the British purpose was to train a class of bureaucrats, whereas in Taiwan the national language policy was to train the entire population, to make everybody either Japanese or Mandarin speakers. So that's a very different purpose of the national language policy, and it was very effective, especially largely effective. And then the second small point I wanted to make was about, I think I might have given a misrepresentation because I'm focusing on indigenous languages, the tribal languages. Those very recently had a kind of movement, and because before 100 years ago, the tribal population was largely uncolonized, right? So so in 1920, the Japanese invaded the mountain and tribal areas, but before that, they were still mostly illiterate and just largely isolated from the colonial metropole. But at that time, even during the Japanese period, there was a campaign to promote the Taiwanese language, the form of Mandarin that was spoken in Taiwan. And there was, even the Japanese used to allow the Taiwanese language poetry groups to publish Taiwanese language poetry in the Japanese papers. So there is a longer history for the Taiwanese speakers.
Okay, well, I'm going to make some light comparisons between Sri Lanka and India. I think it's vital within the Asian language, Asian region, to, of course, associate mother tongue historically and associate it within language and education policies to really situate that and talk about how policies and certain institutional practices have led to different ideas of mother tongue. And I think what's really different about the Sri Lanka case was following independence from the 1940s and 50s, the Swabhasha policy and the shift away from English towards Sinhala and Tamil, right? And that really shaped the way that mother tongue was understood. And I think this coalesced with sort of the historical emergence and solidification of Sinhala and Tamil identities that occurred in the 1930s and 40s, where those identities were really coalesced around language. So language, and specifically mother tongue, became very strongly associated with Tamil and Sinhala ethnic identities, and they were opposed to one another. But then, of course, Muslims identify coalesced identities that were around religion and not language. So then when the education system shifted from English to Sinhala and Tamil medium, that institutional shift associated this language with ethnic identities, with sort of Muslims being an exception to the rule. So Muslims can study either in Sinhala or Tamil medium. So I think that's ways in which Sri Lanka has diverged a lot from India in the way that mother tongue is made sense of, because it's very strongly associated with ethnic identity. And you could say too that Muslims associate a religion-based identity, but then their linguistic association, at least in the South, is with being bilinguals. So you still have language practices being a core part of your identity. So at the same time, we have to differently historically situate mother tongue across Asian nations. What really struck me throughout this course is how many similarities there are, well, at least through India and Sri Lanka, with ideologies of mother tongue. So it's in your mother tongue that you express emotions. It's in your mother tongue that you get upset. It's in your mother tongue that you get consoled when you are upset. It's in your mother tongue that you think, right? So now I'm just going to point forward to some relevant things that are happening in Sri Lanka, and that English is being reintroduced, right? English is being now taught more as a medium of instruction in government schools. You have a growth of international schools that are entirely English medium. Of course, just like in other Asian nations, you have a desire among youth to learn English for social mobility and status. So I was just in Sri Lanka, and what I found is there are a lot of conversation, not necessarily about what your mother tongue is, because still Sinhalese and Tamils, they're going to claim Sinhala and Tamil as a mother tongue. Muslims may claim Arabic, may claim Tamil, may claim no mother tongue at all, may claim English. That's a different situation. But if you're Sinhala and Tamil, even if you're speaking English, you're probably going to claim Sinhala and Tamil as a mother tongue. But there was a lot of discussion of what's your primary language is. What is your first language? And really, the ideology involved in that was, what language do you think in? And that came up in this course a lot. So do you primarily think in your mother tongue? Do you think in English? Do you think in both? What language do you dream in? When you speak English, are you translating from your mother tongue as you're speaking English? Or are you, is your thinking process in English, right? I was even told that my Tamil will improve if I stop thinking in English and then translate it into Tamil. And I was told the best way to make that better would be to listen to Tamil more. Then my thought process will originate in Tamil, and then I'll gain more of the conversational fluency. So that's a major shift in English. In Sri Lanka, it's this re-emphasis on English and how that's shifting, not mother tongue yet, but people's language identity and how they talk about their language dispositions and affiliation. And it's not even something that I brought up. It's something that people are bringing up and talking about right now. The other thing that's really significant in Sri Lanka is a very large Tamil diaspora that formed in Canada, the UK, the US, and other European nations following the anti-Tamil riots of 1983. So now that the war ended in 2009, members of the diaspora are returning to Sri Lanka. Some are investing in land, some are returning to their ancestral homes, some are just visiting for holidays. So it's opened a lot of conversations. I mean, that always had existed, these links between Tamils in Sri Lanka and then members of the, particularly the Canadian diaspora. Something that people are noticing is that younger kids from the diaspora don't always speak Tamil, or don't always speak it well enough that they get recognized as Tamil speakers. So something that came up among people of very different social backgrounds, Muslims, Tamil, different class backgrounds, was, can you claim a Tamil identity in Sri Lanka if you don't speak the language? So this question was posed by many people, and I just listened to answers, and the unanimous answer was no, you can't. And that surprised me. And I also wondered too, what counts as speaking the language? Because some of the young diaspora people who came back could speak Tamil to some extent. So why weren't they being counted as Tamil speakers? And I also heard the ideology that if you're not young people who were attending these English medium international schools, I heard a lot of concern about Tamil language loss. because they are thinking in English now and not thinking in Tamil. So is it what you think in or what you speak? And how does literacy come into play? Because it's very common that Tamil kids in the diaspora will speak Tamil with their mothers and fathers at home, but not read and write. And they're heritage language classes, but a lot of times they don't read and write. So I wonder if the lack of reading and writing is impacting how they're doing them speaking. And you know, what does this narrative of language loss really mean for Tamil identity within Sri Lanka? Another complication is Sinhalese, of course, are also leaving Sri Lanka, particularly following the economic crisis and the events of last summer. So there's going to be larger Sinhala diasporas forming, and they're currently forming. And I think these same questions are going to emerge, and it's going to be interesting to see how they're different from how Tamils are framing these questions. So I'll leave it there.
I wanted to respond because I think there's a very interesting, to the last point that you made, there's a very interesting comparison with, again, not with the indigenous languages, but with Taiwanese. So there are two big concerns that Taiwanese speakers have, people, activists involved in promoting Taiwanese. And one is, first of all, because the languages, you know, they're a lot of people will, I mean, they're both Semitic languages, so there's a fair amount of overlap, which means that a lot of young people who don't have, who weren't raised as that as their first language will often, like there will be, I don't speak the Taiwanese, so I can't really give you a good example, but there will be an original Taiwanese word for something, but a lot of young people won't know that word. So what they will do is they will pronounce the Mandarin characters for that term with the Taiwanese pronunciation. So that's leading to kind of language loss, even as people speak it. And then there's also related to that a big concern over people's inability. There's never been a proper standardization of how to write Taiwanese. I just give you, I mean, you all know karaoke, right? So I had a friend who wrote a dissertation on code switching, which is when people switch between, you know, Mandarin and English and Taiwanese he was looking at medical encounters. When she had to write her transcripts for her PhD dissertation, at that time, now it's much better, but at that time there was no like dictionary or resource she could look up what the proper Taiwanese characters would be for that word. So what she did was watch karaoke videos where she knew that somebody was singing that word in a song, and then would look what character they used for the subtitles.
Okay, so I've just jotted down some notes, and I think probably this can lead to more discussion, but maybe I'll just say something and then we can take a few questions and then we can have a response to everything. So yeah, so that we can get people in on the discussion as well. Just to start off, just some of the things that struck me initially, I mean, that's just I'm hearing you all, one is this interesting thing when we talk about mother tongue. Hello? Okay, so how much do we relate it to this idea of ethnicity? Okay. Now, from Taiwan situation, it seems that it's very clear. There is a national language, which is the ethnicity of maybe it's not considered an ethnic language. Okay, whether that's a Japanese or Chinese, it's basically the colonial language or the language of a very dominant community that doesn't feel like they have any ethnicity. And then there's the tribal groups, which are ethnic groups, ethnic language. In Sri Lanka, language is one of the defining features of ethnicity, right? Mother tongue is also kind of ethnic. But in India, at least for the most part, at least originally how mother tongue was conceived, it wasn't related to ethnicity, right? I mean, it was related more to regions, perhaps, areas. There was this Hindi-Urdu divide, which was, you know, attempted to be on religion. That is, now that's fading a little bit in some sense as Hindi becomes more and more dominant. But in other cases, Bangla, Tamil, Telugu, religion wasn't any kind of factor, right? Even in other areas. So neither was there any ethnicity. But the assertion of languages, particularly tribal languages and smaller languages, we're starting to get some connection between language and ethnicity, mother tongue and ethnicity, right? But it's not in the dominant conception of mother tongue. People say my mother tongue is Hindi. That doesn't mean anything about what ethnic group you are. So this is just some difference, I think. Also, and one way we can try to understand mother tongue, maybe. The other question is about the idea of national language. Okay, you know, in many Asian countries, in Japan, in Taiwan, I think China as well. Is there a concept of national language? Okay, yeah. So in Japan certainly there's a concept. In Taiwan there was a concept national language, right? Here, what is the national language? Say Hindi, right? But yeah, official language, not national, official language. In Sri Lanka, they made 3 national languages, right? Here, there's officially 22, but the official language is Hindi. But this official language, quote unquote, is also a mother tongue of specific people, right? And people claim it to be their mother tongue, okay? Though it's not, you know, a national language in that sense. So, you know, the question is then, is that the same case in other places? Is this what's causing an issue perhaps? Is that this national language that's supposed to be official language of everyone is also the mother tongue of a few? Is this what's causing this friction with Hindi? Whereas in Sri Lanka, it seems to be clear cut more so, except for there's a case of Muslims, but yeah, it's Sinhala and Tamil, and Sinhala tried to be majoritarian, but the Tamils still have their sense of mother tongue ethnicity. You know, there's conflict there. But in India, it's a different case, right? You have a mother tongue of a few that's supposed to be the official language of everyone, right? So, and this is where perhaps we get this conflict, maybe. And the other thing is perhaps one interesting question may be this idea of censorship. So in Sri Lanka, I think Professor Davis in her work, and also she's talked about, you know, if in Colombo, somebody speaking Tamil and then a Sinhala person will be like, I don't like that. That's, you know, the Tamil person may not want to speak it in public in Sinhala places where she was working in Kandy, especially during the war, but even perhaps now, there must be some censorship in which a language is kind of policed. Now in Taiwan, I'm not sure, but it seems like there is a very strong, at least there was, and maybe it's changing a little bit, but still there's a very strong Mandarin public sphere that is so heavy that perhaps people might feel, you know, a little bit ashamed in some sense to speak their own language. Now, to what extent is that in India? I'm not sure. Like, maybe in some cases it could be that way, but I think in many places people speak many different languages and it's more or less tolerated, right? But in some domains, perhaps people feel like they cannot speak. So what are those domains, right? Or why, you know? And this becomes very important, educational domains. You cannot speak, say in IIT, maybe you might feel shy even speaking Hindi. Or in another place, if you speak Santali in your school, you know, Adivasi language, then you may feel ashamed, right? But outside, you may speak it fine. So how this censorship idea works in the different contexts may also be. So these are just some ideas I had to do that. Now, I think we should get some questions. Okay. Oh, but can we, maybe we can just open it up, or would you want to talk about, oh, you're going to forget. Okay, sure. So you can say now and then we'll.
I just wanted to clarify 2 things. First of all, about the idea of whether or not Chineseness was associated with an ethnicity. So in China, at the time of the revolution, they had this idea of sort of a multicultural nation where they have officially, from the beginning, the People's Republic of China had 52 official ethnic groups. Now that erases a lot of mother tongues. And Joe Roche is somebody who's written, for instance, about how having an official Tibetan language has erased many, many languages spoken in Tibet. So that's the first point I wanted to make. But the second one about that was that in Taiwan, on the other hand, though this wasn't true during the Japanese period, during the nationalist period, they actively wanted to promote the idea that all Taiwanese were ethnically Chinese in order to recruit them for the cause of retaking China. And so Chinese ethnic identity was very much a part. School kids during the martial law period did not learn local history. They didn't learn local languages. They learned to memorize the location of train stations in China. So there was very much part of this idea of promoting the language was promoting a concept of Chinese as an ethnicity. And a lot of what's happening now is actually a reaction to that. The second thing I wanted to talk about was about the embarrassment of people speaking in the public sphere. Yes, up until the end of martial law, there was an association of speaking local languages with being uneducated and backwards. And Todd Sandel wrote a very good paper about about the sort of cultural capital associated with sort of speaking Taiwanese. But that started to shift in the 90s. You had a math teacher at the National University who started teaching his math classes in Taiwanese. Then you had the presidential candidate who started giving presidential speeches in Taiwanese. Then you, nowadays, many indigenous scholars will get up and speak for 5 minutes in their own language before switching to Mandarin. So that's changed as well.
Okay. So you want to open it up this time? Okay. Yeah. So you can have the panel respond.
I have a question from Professor Karim. So in case of India, we know that when you transition between two languages, it's a lot of work also, especially if you do it officially. In case of India, they wanted to do away with English in 15 years, and then here we are, 7 or 8 decades later. We still haven't been able to do it. Again, then Chinese is also very typically difficult language to learn because you need to know at least 10,000 characters to write it proficiently. And then it's a tonal language too. It's one of the most difficult languages to speak and to write. So how did they, I understand that if you're in power, then you do hold a lot of power, which was true in case of India too. And they've tried to do it for regional languages, for other things. But it's a very difficult thing to do, as Professor Davis was talking in a lecture also, that now that they're trying to revive the languages, or it's even difficult to get to teachers to teach Tamil as a second language or Sinhala as a second language. It's a very difficult thing. So you come from outside, enforce a foreign language, that too very, very difficult one. How do you do it so efficiently?
Okay, I'm happy to do it either way. So first of all, I think we have to understand the concept of language families. Chinese, yes, is a tonal language, but so is Taiwanese, so is Hakka, the two majority, not the indigenous languages in Taiwan are completely different. They're Austronesian languages. They're closer to Hawaiian than they are to Chinese. But for the majority of Taiwanese citizens, learning another Semitic language was not as difficult as it was for me when I had to go to school. And it took me 3 years to start hearing the tones. Yeah, but for them, actually the tonal contours of Southern Chinese languages are far more complicated than Mandarin. They have 8 tones or 12 tones, and those tones actually shift depending on where things are in the sentence. So actually Mandarin for them was simple in that regard. And they often also were already using characters to write those languages. So they didn't have that same difficulty. The problem now is actually the reverse. And now you don't have people who teachers are able to teach these, like especially the indigenous languages, and finding those resources. And now promoting those languages is very difficult because of that.
So I'm just curious about the position of the English language within Taiwan. So
do we see it as something that's going to overtake Taiwanese, just as we, see it in Japan or China? Like my observation is mostly based on the pop, cinema or drama that is coming out of Japan. So you mostly see that code switching between Japanese and English happening, right? So is that something that you could also see in Taiwan right now?
So actually, I didn't talk about it, but there's a government program right now called Taiwan Bilingual 2030. The idea that Taiwan will be a bilingual Chinese English speaking country in 7 years, which is never going to happen. But they're promoting that bilingual education is very high priority. All the parents want their kids to learn English. There's a huge army of Canadians and Americans in Taiwan teaching English, definitely. But the thing is, it's not competing with Mandarin. It's competing with these other languages. So the thing is, like, students will have English class every single day of the week, but they'll only learn mother tongue classes 1 day a week.
Right. So we kind of, during the course of our discussion, we kind of got to this point where English had a very anxious position within India where, do we, kind of let it position itself as a mother tongue for a few, residents? Do you see that happening in the near future when it's, competing with Mandarin and Taiwanese as a global language?
Not really. I mean, first of all, English isn't the only dominant language in Taiwan. Actually, Japanese is quite powerful as well. You walk around Taiwan, you'll see a lot of signs in Japanese still. They like Japanese, and we're actually, unlike the British experience of a lot of other colonized peoples, because what came after the Japanese colonization, the colonization by the mainlanders who came over in 1947, was so much worse than anything they experienced during the Japanese period. The Japanese actually elevated Taiwan's status economically, and whereas the other people stripped all of Taiwan's resources to go and fight the Chinese. So actually, there's a very nostalgic, even though the Japanese did horrible things, but especially the indigenous people, but there's a very nostalgic view of Japanese culture. In fact, Taiwan's now one of the most popular places for Japanese to retire. It's like the way English people go to southern France or Italy. So, I mean, there's a Japanese and manga and anime and Korean pop, K-pop, or all these other, a lot of people saying Korean now too. So English is actually not necessarily the most important international language for many Taiwanese. It exists in a more complicated sphere where, especially where other regional languages are seen as having a lot more attraction to people sometimes.
Yeah. So about one of the comments you made about language in India being associated more with the region rather than some kind of ethnic source. I think maybe if not in groups, but subgroups like within a state, I think the ethnicity is still there in terms of how you derive it, how authentic of a Tamil speaker are you, and also in terms of Sanskritized languages and non-Sanskritized languages, having different scales of sophistication. And even the very term mother tongue is that you are seeking ancestry and you're inheriting a language, that being a conceptual framework of a dominant understanding of mother tongue. Maybe subjectively, the interpretation is different. And also how a Brahmin speaks a language, how a Dalit speaks a language, and how a middle class person speaks a language, the caste differences, the class differences, and the religious differences. I think in those terms, and especially we had a lot of conversation about Arabi Malayalam and Arabi Tamil, and I think in these situations there's an ethnic side to mother tongue in India.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think there's a lot of difference, and from the beginning, there's always been difference. Now, how do we interpret the difference is the question, right? Because you said caste, you said class, you said religion, you said many differences are there, right? Even region, we talked about Telangana, Telugu, Andhra Telugu. So you see, there's many differences, right? But those differences were not officially or really interpreted as ethnicity in the same way. I guess that's what I'm saying, right? So, but yeah, as far as the difference, and except for in the case of perhaps tribal languages, yeah. So at least they were sort of fenced in around ethnicity, right? And when Jharkhand was being formed, there was an idea that Jharkhand should have many languages as the official language, like this one state, not just Hindi, not just one language, because they wanted to get out of this idea that Jharkhand is one ethnic group. So, of course, as a result, you have no tribal languages as an official language of a tribal state. You have Hindi. So, so yeah, but yeah, so, and I just saying that ethnicity may be one aspect, but I think there were, as you mentioned, like many differences were interpreted along very different lines, and perhaps something like caste. There was a non-Brahmin movement, then that came into Dravidianism, then Dravidianism came into Tamilness, Tamil ethnic identity, this, that. So, you have huge kind of thing.
Just ethnicity in that kind of cheap way of, I remember in Benares hearing an awful lot about Bengalis. Oh my God, just hundreds of hours of talk about what Bengalis are like. And also lots of jokes about Punjabis. Yes, and then Punjabis, jokes about Punjabis, and also, praise of their abilities.
Of course, the association between mother tongue and language and ethnicity is highly overdetermined by policy. Of course, India is not parallel in that way, but like you're saying, it doesn't mean that ethnicity is irrelevant to language and mother tongue.
So when we were discussing about the idea of mother tongue in India, a lot of times when people decide to say a certain language as their mother tongue, there are a lot of policy or political implications involved. So what language am I going to write on my form is on the basis of it's going to give me the most political benefits. So I wanted to know when you mentioned about these 40 varieties being recognized, and also Chinese or Japanese being the national language, is there such kind of aspiration linked to people selecting their mother tongue in Taiwan? What are the implications of it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's Taiwan, very much for indigenous people, language is very much associated with ethnicity, to the point where being able to pass a language test in your claimed mother tongue is essential to be able to get the benefits that come. So for instance, there aren't a lot of benefits, to be honest. It's nothing like reservations in India. But you get a few points added to your national exam score. You might qualify for some scholarships, or you might be able to run for certain offices as an indigenous person. And in order to qualify for all of those things, you have to have at least passed up to a certain level the exam in that language. And that's actually, the idea behind that is to help save those languages. So if you just give people benefits without them having proved that they have those languages, there's no incentive to learn those languages. And but it's actually interesting. It's become quite, nobody looks down on it now. It's actually become quite prestigious to show that, oh, I can, speak my language, or I passed this exam. And you even have ethnic Han Chinese who might try to take an exam in an indigenous language to show that they can. There is a woman who passed a high level of the exam in an indigenous language, and she was on the newspapers and everything celebrated. So it's actually quite now the where it becomes more conflicted is, I think, with the majority language, Taiwanese, just because that is the majority language, but Mandarin is still the official language. So there's a little bit more tension between those two, whereas if people start speaking Taiwanese, a Mandarin speaker who didn't learn it might feel cut out, and that you really, whereas the indigenous languages, it's more performative. where you might just have taken the test, but often people still can't actually have a conversation in those languages. But with the Taiwanese or Hakka, people can really have a conversation, and then if they do that, then the Mandarin speakers will be shut out. And that can create more tension. Well, there are no longer any bans. There was all indigenous languages were banned from 1950s until the 1990s. But now they're encouraged, as I said. Where things are complicated is that not all indigenous languages have gained official recognition. So I mentioned that Taiwan's mostly mountains. And so most of the indigenous groups, the tribals living in the mountains or on the East Coast, who, like I said, were only colonized within the last 100 years, their languages are all recognized. But the people who lived on the West Coast, where the Chinese settlers came, they were much more assimilated. And they've lived together with the ethnic Chinese for 400 years. And so they're trying to revive their language and get recognition from the government. But there's a lot of people questioning, if this language has been dead for so long. They're just reviving it on the basis of a few Bible translations made by the Dutch when they colonized. The Dutch East India Company had actually first people to colonize Taiwan. And their missionaries had created some texts, and they're using that to revive their language. And so there's some controversy over that.
So your lecture was the first introduction for me towards for Taiwan's like basic political and social environment. So I basically wanted to know that, like the kind of 16 national languages there are, how well does all these languages get reflected in the politics? Like there's obviously there might be some competition about how well they're recognized, and how well this competition of recognition gets reflected in the politics. Is it similar like in Indian politics, or is completely different than that, considering there's a Mandarin language that covers the whole of the whole of Taiwan?
I think it's quite different situation from India. Like I said, there's kind of a celebration of Taiwanese multiculturalism because it sets Taiwan apart from China. And so Taiwanese nationalism nowadays is associated with this idea of Taiwan being a multicultural country, including the indigenous languages. So it's very noticeable when the two opposition party candidates, who are not the KMT, the Nationalist Party, which had ruled Taiwan for so long, but when these opposition, we call it the DPP, when DPP presidents were elected, both of them chose to have indigenous people, tribal people, sing at their inauguration. A very strong symbol. One of them actually had been a big celebrity in China, and she was actually the voice of Pepsi Cola in China, and Pepsi had to withdraw all of her ads in China because she sang at the Taiwanese national anthem. So again, these become a symbol. Now, the problem I see is that these languages are liked at the symbolic level, but there's not a lot of support at the actual practical level. So that's where there's a problem.
So my question is that they usually say with a language comes a culture. So have there been any instances of introducing different language to an indigenous landscape, causing cultural change or processes of acculturation? All right. So what usually happens is that with a language being introduced to a different landscape, a cultural landscape, along with it comes a culture. So language usually, the introduction of language to a different landscape usually introduce a new culture. So in the case of Taiwan, have there been instances of cultural change or processes of acculturation with the introduction of language like Japanese or English?
Okay, so there, for the indigenous people, there's, along with the revival of their languages, is also cultural revival. So, you know, during the 50s, after the KMT took over, they allowed the Japanese had banned missionaries in Taiwan. Now, I think this will be familiar in India in the Northeast, where there's a lot of Christians. So there's about 80% of indigenous people in Taiwan are Christian, even though most Taiwanese are not. Most Taiwanese are Buddhist or Taoist or some mix. With the revival of languages, there's also been a return of animistic practices. I have a master's student who's working with me who's become an indigenous shaman. And he's also a language teacher. So he's both a language teacher and an indigenous shaman. So these things are connected.
Again, have there been any sort of resistance to the introduction of these languages from the indigenous communities or the political front? So I was asking, have there been any sort of resistance, political and otherwise resistance from the indigenous communities to the introduction of new languages? Introduction of languages.
I see. No, I mean, you know, there isn't a lot of resistance at all. And most people, I mean, like I said, the hardcore indigenous activists are worried that like this English bilingual policy will hurt efforts to promote their languages. But, you know, I should say, I mean, Taiwan's really, I mean, not only have they, are they now teaching these 16 indigenous languages as well as the two main Sinitic languages, Taiwanese and Hakka, they're also teaching Vietnamese, Indonesian, and sign language. Yeah, and I mean, it creates problems. I know I heard of a school where there was a boy whose father was indigenous and his mother was Vietnamese, and he was pulled into the Vietnamese class because they didn't have any students to take that class. They needed to have that, you know. But you know, it's actually, I mean, really, Taiwan's, like I said, at the symbolic level, people are very, very open and supporting. The problem is taking a language one day a week for 40 minutes is not going to actually teach you to speak that language. So that's the real problem, is that the actual practical level, these languages are dying, and these policies are not doing anything to reverse it. Meanwhile, English is being promoted at a level that very likely will make everybody bilingual. Maybe not by 2030, but you know, later on. And so you can see where the actual priorities are. And yeah, so a lot of people are upset about that, but it's not a kind of thing that's going to bring people to blows or anything like that.
Professor, so in your talk, you mentioned that there's a need to preserve Taiwan language, something related to that. So in India, we have Central Institute of Indian Languages, which take care of all the tribal languages or minority languages and document them. And in a way, they digitalize and preserve the language and culture. So do you have, I mean, does Taiwan have any sort of that sort of institutions?
Taiwan is doing the same thing, and that part's been wonderful. Taiwan has the Institute of Linguistics at the Academia Sinica, which is a leading research institute, has several linguists working entirely in what are called Formosan languages. And there's also an indigenous institute that is entirely devoted to promoting. They oversee the exam system, they oversee the documentation, they give money for creating TV shows and radio shows and translating books into these languages and writing all these tests I mentioned. So there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money and resources pouring into this. The problem is it's not all this money. I mean, so this is the thing about indigenous languages. They're often preserved the way people might preserve plants in a museum. They're not really, the idea of them actually becoming living languages again is not, most people don't have that as a goal, even the indigenous people themselves. So like my student is one of the few people who's trying to say, look, other countries, Hawaii, New Zealand, other places have managed to actually make their languages living languages again. We don't have to accept this kind of museum model. But unfortunately, it's the museum model that's dominating. So there is funding for this museum model, but it's not necessarily helping.
Sorry to bother you again, but then, so when it comes to some of the Indian indigenous languages, there have been script movements for a standardized script in different parts of India. For example, Santali language in Eastern India came up with a script called Olchiki, almost standardized, and even the course of Santali is being taught in different universities. So can you sort of briefly explain the scenario of Taiwan when it comes to scripting indigenous language?
Quite familiar with that from Nishan's work. In Taiwan, almost all of the scripts were created by missionaries. Now there are problems with that. They were primarily concerned with translating the Bible. And so this has led to semantic shifts where a traditional word meaning a kind of animistic spirit then becomes the Holy Ghost in a Catholic text. And so there's a need to kind of excavate and archive what the original meanings were. And there have been tensions. I've actually have an unfinished paper about tensions within dialectal groups over certain letter choices, orthographic choices. So for instance, you know, there's of the Amis Banza language I work with, there are 5 recognized dialects. There are actually many more, but there are 5 that have official recognition. And 4 of them don't really make a phonetic distinction between the O and U. So like my student Shifu, it's sort of, it can be written Shifu with an O or Shifu with a U, and it wouldn't really matter. But there is one dialect where they actually maintain a meaningful, productive distinction between those 2 sounds. And so there's been a long debate within the efforts to try and standardize this language, whether or not to preserve the letter U. And you know, one of the most wonderful talks I heard, I was at one of these debates, so it was getting quite heated. And he's indigenous, he's also a priest, he got up and he said, when we, indigenous people, when we dance in a circle. So we should use O. Yeah, so they have these debates.
So yeah, if there's last question. Dinner time.
Firstly, thank you for this session. It was a very insightful session. We have been discussing a lot about revival of language and also the context of colonialism. What exactly constitutes the revival of language is my question. So if I'm allowed to digress a little bit, if I can consider the example of Gogi, who was the author of Decolonizing the Mind. Initially, he wrote in English, then he switched back to his own native indigenous language, because according to him, this was his way of revival of language and his way of decolonizing the mind. But there are other authors who continue to write in the colonial language because that allows them a larger audience to reach out to. So what are your views on it?
This is a huge debate. For instance, in Africa, you have a debate between Chinua Achebe and Wationgo, one who chose to write in English and the other one who chose to write in his own, I forget the name of Wationgo's language, but it's a Kenyan language. And he made a shift. He had originally written in English and then shifted back. It's interesting reading their debates because one of the things that Achebe has said, is that when we write in English, we're not just writing in English, we're also we're appropriating English. And you see this, I mean, so many Indian authors have made English something different, right? I mean, where famous Indian authors have really kind of changed the English language by writing in it in very fundamental ways and have been internationally recognized for that. And and you have that too. So there's a very famous indigenous writer. So there's one part of Taiwan that's indigenous, but it's a little different from the rest. It's an island called Orchid Island. And the people there actually migrated, the indigenous people originally migrated from Taiwan to the Philippines. And this one group migrated back from the Batanes Islands in the Philippines back to this island, which then became part of Taiwan. So they're a little bit more recent. And there's a writer there, internationally recognized writer named Shimon Rapongan. And Rapongan writes in Mandarin, but again, he's done this kind of thing where he's changed Mandarin and transformed it into something different. So I think that's an option. Unfortunately, there's very little, most indigenous writers in Taiwan do write in Mandarin. There are very few who are capable of writing in their own language to that same degree just because of the history. Though I think now that might starting to be changed. But a lot of the texts that are written in indigenous languages right now are written for children. You know, they're folk tales, they're oral traditions that have been transcribed. And there's a wonderful amount of literature. But really, if you do go through all the difficulty of learning your indigenous language, what can you read in it? You can read the Bible, you can read some children's books. There's not much else. So that's a real problem. Whereas in the Sinitic languages that were oppressed, like Taiwanese and Hakka, there's a huge literature and there are films and there's songs. And so the amount of, we talk about, we use a concept from sociology of cultural capital. There's a tremendous amount of cultural capital that you can gain from writing and work and singing and performing in those languages. Whereas there is a lot of song in indigenous languages, but apart from song and the Bible and some children's books, there's not a lot of literature that's been written in that. But I think people are hoping to change that.
Okay, I think we're done. So thank you. Thanks. Thank you all for your very excellent questions. Now we can take a group photo. Yes, we have to take one. The worst part of the evening, I know. You wanna go to that? Oh, you mean? Oh, yeah. We can. Oh yeah. Hi, so can you turn off the- Okay, those of you who want to be in the picture, course participants have